In this video, we're going to learn about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And this is really the last big model for the course. It is a pretty big, complicated conceptual model. So be sure to ask questions when you have them, all right? Probably the first thing you need to know is that this model has absolutely nothing to do with the model of supply and demand, okay? So if you're thinking, oh, I know demand and supply, just forget it. This model really does not relate to the model of supply and demand at all. In the model of supply and demand, we're talking about one single market and prices in that market. Okay, in the model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, we're talking about total supply and total demand in the economy. Now, before we dive in, I want to just tell you where this model comes from. Okay, this model was developed by perhaps one of the most famous economists, John Maynard Keynes. You will hear people talk about Keynesianism, neo-Keynesianism, post-Keynesianism, right? So he really helped define the trajectory of macroeconomics in terms of his thinking about short-run business cycles and how we address them. And this is going to be a basic version of the model that he developed to explain short-run business cycle fluctuations. Now, this is not the only school of thought as to why these fluctuations occur, but it will give you a foundational understanding about how we approach thinking about business cycles, what type of policy options the government has to address them or to try to reduce fluctuations, and why the government is doing what they're doing, right? So this is a really good like intro level foundation to thinking about macroeconomic policy. All right, so like I said, Keynes developed this model really in the follow-up to the Great Depression. The Great Depression happened and we were like, what happened, right? So many people were unemployed for a long time, and we really started at that point thinking about these short-run business cycle fluctuations, whereas that had not been something that economists were even talking about prior to the Great Depression. So all of our models prior to this were focused on long-run equilibrium, and Keynes said, you know what, that's dumb. In the long run, we're all dead, right? We exist in the short run, and what we want to focus on here are short-run economic fluctuations. Okay, so in this video, we're going to introduce the aggregate demand curve. In the next video, we'll introduce the aggregate supply curves. And then following that, we'll have more videos to talk about how we use the model. So you got to be patient here. It's going to take us a while to set this up. But like I said, understanding what we mean when we say aggregate demand and aggregate supply is really the key part to understanding how to use this model. Okay, so aggregate demand is the relationship here between the aggregate price level, right? Aggregate price level. That means, like, on average, the level of prices in the economy across all goods, right? Something like we're measuring when we measure inflation. We created our CPI or our GDP deflator. Those would be measures of the aggregate price level. So we want to think about the relationship between the aggregate price level and total or aggregate consumption, right? Demand is consumers, so we're still thinking here about consumption. So that's the total quantity of goods and services that people purchase, okay? And so to think here about what that looks like, what is the relationship between the overall price level in the economy and the amount of stuff that we purchase, we're going to break expenditures or purchases down into different categories. And this is a throwback to the national income identity. You'll remember we talked earlier on when we talked about GDP about saying that total output was equal to total expenditures, and total expenditures was equal to consumption expenditures, investment expenditures, government expenditures, and net exports. We have that same, right, concept here. We've got our different categories of aggregate expenditures. And then we want to think about how that might change as the price level changes. Now remember, this is not demand. It's not like, oh, prices on average are going up, so I want to buy less because I can't afford to buy as much. That's not what's happening here, right? When we say the aggregate price level goes up, we mean the price of everything in the economy is going up. That means your income is going up, right? So if your income is going up, say prices double, your income doubles, your wealth in the bank doubles, like, why are you spending more money? That doesn't necessarily make sense. So it should not be immediately obvious to you that aggregate demand is downward sloping. Aggregate demand is downward sloping, and I'm going to tell you why. But the first thing you have to realize is that this is not the same thing as an individual market demand curve. All right. When we say aggregate demand is downward sloping, what do we mean? We mean that as the price level decreases, we would expect total expenditures to increase, okay? If the price level decreases, that will lead to an increase in total expenditures. Okay, why? Well, because we have changes in each of these different categories of aggregate demand. We have changes in consumption spending, investment spending, and net exports. And here we kind of ignore government spending because the government determines how much to spend, right? They pass a bill and they say, we're going to increase spending, or we're going to decrease spending. And that does not necessarily just relate in terms of economics to the general price level. It's a political decision. So we're going to just leave government spending alone for now and think about the other categories that go into aggregate expenditures. All right, so we're going to walk through now why aggregate expenditures might increase as the price level decreases. And these are really important to understand. So if you have questions as we're going through this, feel free to start a thread on the discussion board because these are not easy concepts to get. Okay. Why is aggregate demand downward sloping? All right, so first reason is that as the price level decreases, it changes the amount, the value of the cash in your pocket. As the price level decreases, it changes the value of a dollar, right? It changes the value of your cash. It doesn't really change your real income, right? Because like I said, if prices double and your income doubles, then it's really, you have the same purchasing power. If prices double and the amount of money in your bank doubles, right? Again, you have the same purchasing power. Why would it be that prices doubling lead to a doubling of your income? Well, you have to remember that everything that is spent is something that is earned, right? Every transaction has two sides, the buyer and the seller, right? So every dollar you spend is someone else's income. And every dollar of your income is someone else's spending. So when we say that the prices of everything in the economy go up or double or go down, it means incomes also go up or double or go down, right? And same in your bank account, right? Your interest rate that you're earning in the bank should reflect both the real interest rate, but also the rate of inflation, right? So when the price level decreases, it doesn't affect your income. It does not affect your wealth that's stored in the bank account. It does affect the purchasing power of the cash in your pocket, right? The cash in your pocket, the $20 bill sitting in your wallet, is now worth more, right? It's worth more because prices went down. You can buy more with that $20. So the real purchasing power of cash or hard currency has increased because of the decrease in the price level. And so because that $20 bill in your wallet is now worth a little bit more as prices go down, this might lead you to feel slightly more wealthy, although most of us don't hold a lot of wealth in cash. You might feel a little bit more wealthy, and you might increase your spending slightly. Okay, so this could lead to a small increase in consumer wealth, and therefore a small increase in consumer spending, but only in the short run, right? Only with that cash that's sitting in your wallet, then the price level change does not affect anything else, okay? So all of these are going to be short run impacts, and you'll notice that they're all pretty small. So the wealth effect here has to do with consumption. Has to do with consumption spending, consumer spending, I should say. Okay, anyway. And you'll notice that each of these effects that we're talking about will deal with a different variable in this national income identity equation, all right? So the wealth effect explains why a change in price level might lead to a change in consumer spending. The interest rate effect, the next effect here, the interest rate effect explains why a change in the general price level might lead to a change in investment spending, okay? So the next one here is a change in investment. So as the price level decreases, that affects the value of money. Each dollar bill is now worth more and can be used to buy a larger quantity of goods and services. So how does that affect money demand? Well, if each dollar is worth more, I need to hold fewer dollars in order to make my day-to-day purchases. And so the quantity of money demanded decreases, and people will shift their assets out of their checking account, out of cash, and into an interest-bearing account, like a savings account, right? And when they do that, when they shift money into less liquid accounts, into their investment accounts, what they're doing is saving, right? And that increases the supply in the loanable funds market. So in the loanable funds market, we've got an increase in supply, and that's going to lead to a new interest rate that is lower with a higher equilibrium quantity of loanable funds, right? So the interest rate is decreasing, leading to an increase in borrowing and therefore investment spending, again, in the short run. All right, so the last one here is the exchange rate effect. So this has to do with net exports. So savers now are looking at shifting their assets into less liquid accounts. The interest rate, though, is dropping, not yielding them a high rate of return on their investments, on their savings. I know we colloquially use investment to mean savings, whereas in economics, we use investment to mean business spending. So just to make that distinction. So savers aren't getting a high rate of return, right? They're not getting a very high interest rate because interest rate is dropping due to shifting of wealth, the increase in supply into the loanable funds market. Now, savers are always going to seek the highest rate of return on their investment, right? So you want to find an account that's going to pay you the highest interest rate, or invest in a stock that's going to yield a higher rate of return. And so as the domestic interest rates are dropping in this example, as the domestic interest rates drop, money will flow out of the country seeking higher rates of return abroad, okay? So we have an increase in the supply of domestic currency on the foreign exchange market, right? So we're tying in exchange rates here. We've got people trying to put their money into higher rate of return accounts abroad because the domestic interest rate is falling, and to do that, they've got to change currency, right? So say this is the US, we've got more dollars on the international market available to change. That's going to lead the currency to depreciate, right? It's going to make the currency worth less because the supply of the currency on the foreign exchange markets is higher. Okay, so we have currency depreciation, and as the currency decreases in value, then what happens to our incentives to import and export? Well, when, say, the US dollar is not worth very much, it's going to be really expensive for people in the US to buy things that were purchased abroad, right? So imports will decrease. Likewise, when the US dollar is not worth very much, it's cheaper for people who live in Europe to buy things produced in the US. And so exports will increase. And both of these factors, the decrease in imports and the increase in exports, lead to an increase in net exports, because remember, net exports is equal to exports minus imports. So that leads to a decrease in net exports, again, in the short run. Sorry, an increase. Did I say decrease? So that leads to an increase in net exports, again, in the short run, right? Okay, so these are the 3 reasons why aggregate demand is downward sloping. I want you to understand these reasons. So if you have questions, again, go to the discussion board and we'll work it out, okay? All right, what shifts aggregate demand then? What would shift aggregate demand? We talked about why aggregate demand is downward sloping, but what factors might cause it to shift? Well, any changes in one of these variables, like C, I, G, or net exports, right? Any changes in those variables that are not due to changes in price level would lead to a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so changes in consumer attitude, these are sort of some examples of things that might lead to changes in one of the variables in aggregate demand. That would shift C, right? Maybe people are just feeling really good about the economy and they go out and spend a bunch of money because they're optimistic about economic growth, or maybe the opposite, right? Changes in investment opportunities or changes in the loanable funds market. Okay, would change I. Government spending, obviously, right? Government spending, all right. And changes in what's happening around the world, what's happening in other countries is going to affect the foreign exchange market, and that's also going to affect what's happening to the value of our currency, to net exports, and then what's happening to aggregate demand. Okay. Good. So hopefully you understand a little bit more about what I mean when I say aggregate demand, keeping in mind this general identity here will be very useful for you as you organize your thoughts around aggregate demand. Next video, we'll talk about aggregate supply. And then once we understand the model, we can start using it to show us how business cycle fluctuations occur.